Hi and welcome. I'm Mohammad Nova from IPMI International Business School, and today me and my fellow would like to give you a sneak peek of a very interesting book called Globalization and its Content Revisited, written by Joseph Eugene Stiglitz in 2017. So a little information about the author. Mr. Stiglitz is an economist and also professor in the United States of America, and he's also a Nobel Prize winner in 2001 and has written a lot of books. And the book that we're going to discuss today is the updated version of one of his best-selling books that he wrote in 2002. So without further ado, let's get into it. The first part of the book, or the first 4 chapters, is about the newest content of globalization that the author has just revealed. He explains how mismanaged globalization hugely affects the trading ecosystem, but it doesn't stop there. Also in other point of view, such as investment, how Trump's new protectionist way of investment may hamper job creation in the United States of America, and also in other point of view such as taxes, how global corporations have induced competition among their jurisdictions around the world just to lower taxes, and also from other point of view in later discussed in the book. And lastly, in chapter 4, Mr. Stiglitz offered the idea of a proper globalization. He set 10 basic principles as the backbone and the guideline for this to succeed. The promise of global institution. This chapter introduces the major global economic institutions such as GATT, that later become the World Trade Organization, that oversees the global trade, and then the IMF, who lent money to the developing countries that is in crisis, and lastly is the World Bank, which was created to eliminate poverty in developing nations. Now, globalization has had some positive effects. In some cases, it has created jobs in developing countries and also connected the nations of the world through trade. Yet, for many in the developing world, globalization has not brought the promised economic benefits. In fact, the globalization has reduced either poverty or the vast inequality between the super rich and the rest of the population, and it got worsened by the global financial institution that had maintained the monopoly over lending of money to help developing countries grow their industries. The lending or the loan come with high interest and are given only if the borrower agrees to strict conditions, which limit its ability to serve its citizens, which is very detrimental for the borrower country. Broken promises. There is a stark contrast between the IMF and the World Banks, whereas the World Bank's dedication to eliminate poverty has deepened its engagement in the developing countries it helps. And on the other hand, IMF has become more aloof and seemingly disinterested in the nations that it is helping. And although the IMF's loans are intended to remedy economic crisis, the IMF has generally become the premier lending institution for developing countries. And yet the fact is that since IMF has imposed its ideology on these countries, the number of people living in absolute poverty or living less than $1 per day has actually increased. And Mr. Stiglitz viewed this IMF's approach of global economic aid as something detrimental and misguided, and also an overly rigid strategy that actually does not accomplish any of their goals. Freedom to choose. The liberalization policies that the IMF imposes on the other nation are rarely, if ever, taken into account the information about the nation's wants or needs. Washington consensus are imposed without giving a thought to the developing country's economic conditions, and the IMF often demands that the services provided by the government are to be taken over by private for-profit enterprises without learning whether it will work or not. But the Marcos government program case had proven that it didn't work. The IMF believes that the market always works perfectly. When there's a demand, a perfect supply source will miraculously appear. However, this is rarely the case. Developing nations that are forced to open their economy to free trade are often suffer from the consequences of Washington consensus bias and inequity that hurt the developing nations but benefit the rich.
Hi, I'm Giovanni. I will share about the next chapter, the East Asia crisis, how IMF policies brought the world to the verge of the global meltdown. It is the tale about the Thai currency debate collapsed in July 1997, when the speculator feared and they sold the currency, which ultimately led the Thailand financial crisis because it lost all financial values. The government leads the such excellent economic growth and operation that Thailand was considered the part of East Asia miracle. Yet after Thailand had pressure from IMF to quickly liberalize its financial sector, Thailand without a regulatory framework made this nation vulnerable to foreign investor action. When investor sentiment turned negative and the money flowed out of the Thailand, Stigit believed that EMS policies simply reflected the interests and ideology of Western financial community without solving the crisis in Asia. Here's some EFF mistake. The first round of the mistake. EMF policy governments reduced the expenditure, and the second EMS told the East Asian nation to create trade surplus to increase export than its imports. And EMF anti-inflation policy forced East Asian nation to raise interest rate. And the second mistake is bumbling restructuring. For EMF, restructuring means banks that had bad loans on their books should be shut down, and the companies that own the money should be closed or taken down by their creditors. The next chapter is who lost to Russia. After Soviet Union had collapsed in late 1991, the IMF changed Russia from companies which the price of goods and the services were detected by the government and sometimes lower than actual price to be a capitalized economy. Price fluctuate because they are determined by the market. The first thing of the IMF did was to impose price liberalization in Russia. Price increased so fast in double-digit rates per month that make Russia soon experience hyperinflation. People lost their entire saving by just buying the necessity and bring inflation under control. To rescue, the IMF lent Russia 11 billion to support the value of the ruble and the failing economy of Russia. Russia was also quickly become one of the most corruption economies in the world. After Russia granted the loan, Russia announced a unilateral suspension of payment and a devaluation of the ruble. Within hours or days of deflation, Russia oligarchy had sent their money out of the country. Here, three reasons why Russia collapsed. First, high interest rate create debt economic growth because no ordinary business person could afford to borrow such high interest rate. And the second, the policy of the rapid and unregulated privatization create another corruption. And the last, absent social capital like mafia organization took an advantage of the economic chaos.
Hi, I'm Argia and I will cover Chapter 7 tonight. The IMF and the US Treasury turned a blind eye to corrupt Russian practices such as the loans for share program because they felt it kept the President Boris Yeltsin in power and he was willing to go along with shock therapy policies. Western financial institutions supported Yeltsin as a bulwark against communist resurgence. They undermined other Russian political and economic leaders who sought an open debate on shock therapy, which had impoverished so many Russians. The US Treasury and the IMF quashed any attempts to moderate the market fundamentalism embodied in shock therapy. To this end, they were willing to overlook Russian corruption. The Treasury supported the oligarchs and their political power in Russia and dismissed an alternative economic strategy that might have produced real economic growth. Different countries pursued different strategies in transitioning from a communist to a capitalist economy. Those that strictly followed the IMF's rigid liberalization policies experienced more problems during transition and had poorer results than those nations that more or less ignored the IMF's policy. Poland and China ignored the IMF's policy and forced transition strategies that more attuned to their citizens' needs. Their homegrown strategies maintained both economic and political stability. Poland just studied down the shock therapy, road to reduce inflation, but then fashion policies less likely to result in social dislocation. It created the necessary financial infrastructure before embarking on widespread privatization. Its policies emphasized job creation and the maintenance of social safety net during the unavoidably stressful period of transition. Poland also made sure it had the majority of citizen support for the social and economic changes that were being made. Meanwhile, China had the most successful transition of all. It slowly introduced a policy of individual responsibility, which incrementally permitted farmers to own and sell some of their crops. This program was expanded slowly, and only after the central government saw that it worked and was popular among the people, as the program was allowed to expand, it gained support among China's rural population. Another ingenious program is to introduce a two-tier price system that left the old common economy prices for some goods, but allow market pricing for other goods. Once people got used to any profited from market pricing, the old pricing system was abandoned. China also kept its social safety nets in place and created the needed regulatory institutions before it slowly began to privatize its state-owned enterprises. Poland and China transition experience stands in sharp contrast to that Russia and Czech Republic. The Czech Republic followed IMF prescriptions to the letter and quickly implemented radical liberalization reforms without taking the wishes or experiences of their citizens into account. In Russia, rapid privatizations led to widespread corruption and deep inequalities between the oligarchs and the ordinary people. Real economic growth was sacrificed to corrupt privatizations. Nearly all the benefits of privatizations accrue to those close to the Kremlin. Millions of people living throughout this vast nation were destitute. At the behest of the IMF, Russia did not first establish the necessary regulatory and oversight institutions before it created a class of oligarchs who came to dominate the country both economically and politically.
Okay, next, chapter 8 and 9 will be presented by me, Albert Yuda. In chapter 8, this is about the IMF other agenda. So the IMF has lost its way. Its original mandate was a global financial institution intended to lend money to nations in financial crisis to maintain stability and promote growth. By the 1990s, the IMF had become an institution with a primary mission to liberate the economic of nations in financial distress. Liberalization is shown to create more problem than solution for developing country. The author show how the IMF liberalization agenda most likely developed. The IMF manager and decision maker are chosen behind closed door, and it has never been viewed as a prerequisite that they should have any experience in developing world. Many of IMF policy are geared more toward making the lending bank whole than curing the economic ills of the debtor nation. The author described how Western banks that were lending money to Russia in 1990s were dictating to the IMF how large a bailout they thought was needed to ensure that were repaid. IMF bailout may help Western creditors, but they are essential new loan made to the debtor nation. His type of policy simply digs a deeper hole of deep debt for a country in financial trouble. One reason of IMF is so important is that it operates as a guarantor of repayment. Lenders don't have a considered negative outcome because the IMF makes sure that the in-debt nation take out new loans to pay what it owns. This is good for the banks, but it usually has dire consequences for the debtor country. The more loans of developing nation must take out just to cover repayment of previous loan, make it increasingly impossible for the nation to have any money left to promote economic growth or provide service to its population. The next is chapter 9, is about the way ahead. So there is an urgent need to reform of global economic institution, particularly the IMF. To make them more responsive to the need of developing nations, the IMF secretiveness and lack of transparency make it difficult for client nations to have a say in the creation of new economic policy. Basic reform of the IMF must address its conflict objective, helping developing nations or serving Western financial interests. The author advised the IMF to refocus on its original mission to manage economic crisis in developing or transitioning country. To accomplish this, the IMF and also WTO should give representatives from developing countries a seat at the table and one with the actual power or influence on decision making when policy decisions that will affect them are discussed and determined. The leaders of the IMF were more representative of the people they are charged with helping. Decision will reflect the aspiration and need of citizens and not just interests of Western finance. The author believes that this fundamental change in governance is what will make globalization work for all people. And then the author suggests that developing a nation be given the opportunity to choose for themselves their own development strategy so long as they are otherwise economically sound. So, end of chapter 8 and 9. Thank you.